So what we're going to do today is we are looking at a planning process for whatever world we're going to be living into next in this kind of post-pandemic world, right? This is a very nebulous, very strange time we're in because we're kind of in this, it's almost like an interregnum, right? It's in between two eras. And we're all kind of in this medium space, not knowing exactly what things are going to look like. But one thing that we learned from the beginning of the pandemic is the need to really be thinking about questions and operations and what we're going to be doing next. For most all of us, I don't know about you all, but I did not have a plan in my files for a major pandemic on how we were going to operate as an organization and how we were going to support you in your operations and in your organizations. So what we had to do is create on the fly, right? And looking at the way that you all operated your programs is actually pretty amazing in what you were able to accomplish. But now we can start having conversations internally and externally about what our world is going to look like and what our outreach programs are going to look like in this next phase, because we know something is going to be changing, right? We also know that we are not the same that we were before the pandemic. That world and those circumstances are past us now, right? And even if tomorrow morning we all wake up, magically everyone has been vaccinated, we're back going to restaurants, we know that we will still not be going back to the world we were at pre-pandemic, because the cultural shifts have been so significant, right? So what we have to do now is start thinking about what we're going to do and how we're going to look, right? What's it going to be look like in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, right? And so we have the opportunity right now to start thinking about that. Because one thing I realize is in the midst of these major shifts that are happening, we are reactors, right? We react to what's happening. Oh my gosh, they shut down X. We have to react and do Y. Oh my goodness, we're getting overrun with people in need of more food. We react, we get more food. So we can live in that reaction state, and we have to in our role in outreach, but we also have to be strategic enough to really think through and look at what the next steps are. And so this is our attempt at kind of working through those proactive steps in planning and thinking. Now, what we're going to do in the Sustainability Institute is essentially give you a map, an idea. Like if you think about it like a rubber band, right? A rubber band can be small and you can stretch it, and it can be bigger, and it can just kind of be customized to whatever you need. So the system we're going to give you today is like a rubber band, right? This could be a planning process that lasts a year in different organizations. Or this could be a decision process that you do with just a couple of people over a few weeks, right? It's meant to expand and contract to what you need. Now, what we're not going to be able to do in this session, because we only have about an hour that we're gonna kind of talk, and then we'll stay on for questions for as long as you all want, is we're not going to be able to get into every detail for each one of our programs, right? So we're not going to talk specifically about youth programs, and we're not going to specifically talk about feeding programs or education programs, right? What we're going to do is talk about things in general, and then if it's helpful, we'll have follow-up conversations. So maybe in another month or another few weeks, if you've had a chance to kind of work through some of these issues in a feeding program, maybe we'll get all of us together and say, like, what are you learning? What are you hearing? How are you going to set different benchmarks for those things? Okay, so this one, we're going to look at that big picture issue of planning and thinking about the pandemic. And then in follow-up conversations, we'll look more specifically at our very specific areas that we want to see. Okay, Um, the other, I was joking around the SK. I feel like this whole presentation is littered with metaphors. So I'm very, very sorry for that, but it's how I think. So whatever. So what you're going to find is there's going to be kind of four major areas that we're going to talk about. It's going to be research, setting objectives, developing programming, and doing evaluation. If you think about it like a buffet, I grew up in the Midwest, so we all did buffets, right? Or I did buffets, right? What I'm not saying is like, you don't go to a buffet and you don't eat everything in each section. You don't eat everything in the salad section, everything in the side section, everything in the meat section. And you definitely just don't go straight for the dessert. You test things out a little bit. You try different things. And so we're going to have all kinds of questions and so many different options for you. You don't have to use them all. Use what you need. But you should probably think about it in an order, and then do what's helpful. So we're going to dive into this, and we have a PowerPoint up here. We're also going to put into the chat a link to a Dropbox. And what you're going to find in here is some really great stuff. One, you're going to see you'll see this PowerPoint. So again, you don't have to take notes. You can just, if taking notes is helpful, that's great. But like, you have access to all of this. We've also created a workbook. This workbook is actually connected to the PowerPoint. So you'll see at points in the PowerPoint, it's going to be referring to what page in the workbook it is, so that you can use that as a tool if it's helpful. Again, you're going to hear from us if it's helpful a lot. Use what's good, use what's helpful to your program. Don't worry about the rest of it. So if you see in the chat right now, SK has just dropped the link in. You can pull that up if you want to, or you can wait till after the session and look through it again, okay? One of the other things you're gonna find in there is it says resource bundle. Don't open that yet. I mean, you can, doesn't matter. It's like 100 pages of background information. So don't worry about that. That's for a different step here. But what we're gonna be walking through is the PowerPoint. And if you wanna have open one thing, I would open up the workbook, okay? So let's move on, SK, to some preliminary thoughts here. What we decided to call this is building transformational communities in a post-pandemic world, right? Your communities that you have built up, the programs that you are leading, have been transformational before the pandemic, have been especially key and essential during the pandemic, and will be even more important in a post-pandemic world. And so thinking about it in those terms, I think is really, really important. As we said before, the pandemic has shifted us significantly. We don't even know the ways in which it's completely impacted us, and we won't know that for years, right? But we know we're starting to see some of the signs of it. We're seeing issues of anxiety skyrocketing, mental health issues. If you look in the Times this morning, there was an article about youth and the suicide rates are significantly increasing because of COVID, right? These are systemic things. And we know that many of the communities that we work with have been hit the hardest. Communities of color, those whose immigration status is undocumented, those who are the working poor, who are right on that bubble. That bubble burst and they have been sunk, right? The pandemic has altered us and changed us in significant ways. And so we got to kind of switch out of that mindset of, I can't wait till we go back to the way things used to be. That's not going to happen. So what we have to do is look at how we're going to create this new community in a new world. It doesn't mean that your program is going to look nothing like it did before the pandemic. It will, because it's you and it's in your community, stuff like that. But we need to get away from the idea that it's going to look identical or just a little change here and there to the way it was before the pandemic. Second thing, flexibility. Flexibility is essential through all of this, right? We all have to adapt to the changing circumstances, and we don't know how things are going to continue to change. I didn't have a pandemic on my radar screen for 2020. I don't know what I don't have on my radar screen for 2022, right? So what we need to do is kind of maintain this sense of flexibility and adapting to whatever is happening around us. Another image that I want you to kind of keep in mind is that we should think about this transition into this kind of post-pandemic world as a faucet being turned on or off, and not a light switch turning on or off, right? When I walk into a room, I flip the light switch, boom, we're there. A faucet is going to turn slowly. It may start with a drip and then come a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little more, right? None of us are going to wake up one day and the pandemic is going to be over, right? It's going to end at different points, and it's going to ebb, and it's going to flow, and it's going to feel different. And in different communities, they're going to experience the after effects of the pandemic in different ways. So just like you're going to have to figure out how to kind of ease into this new reality, right? Keeping that flexibility, understanding it like a flow. We also need to be thinking about, when we're transitioning our programs into a new era, doing it slowly. If you're a feeding program, I would probably not recommend that in this week you are doing grab and go, and next week everybody's doing choice again. That's flipping something on like a light switch. Your systems probably can't take that much shock, right? But easing it and finding a way to stage and stagger that may be a better way to look at it and think about it. Again, don't try to set a date in your mind as to we'll be back to normal, right? We're going to move into a new normal, right? Remember that even in the pandemic, you all have done incredible things. You all have figured stuff out. You all went through a stress test that should have sunk y'all, right? But you found a way. Use those new strengths in this. When we think about the pandemic, we will think and we will grieve and we will mourn the losses that we've all experienced. But we're not looking at the full truth of it if we only look at the negatives. To really understand the full truth of this pandemic experience, we have to look at the positive things that have come out of it as well. I've seen some of your financials. A lot of you found new donors, new volunteers. You developed new ways of meeting needs in your community. You would actually be doing a disservice to yourself and to your programs if you, quote, went back to the way things were, right? So in this process, we want to make sure you're taking time to realize not only the chaos that we've all been through in this last year, but the ways in which you all met those challenges and how you want to take that in and use that going forward. Again, I just want to emphasize this. If you are anxious about going back to the way things were, then you will have lost all the things that you gained in this last year. And what I think we want to do is build on that momentum and try to discern what we're going to do next. Okay? Another warning for you. Anytime you're doing strategic planning or thinking about next steps, I'll say this, I want to skip to the end. I want to go do a thing, right? Oh no, oh, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to open up again. Here's how we're going to do our tutoring program. No, this is great. We're just going to go do this. Let's go. Right? It's that ready, fire, aim kind of attitude. Right? And a lot of that comes from a good place because we're like, we got to go do something. What we're going to encourage you to do in this process is to take that energy of wanting to do something, and we're going to tell you to take it and sit with it and think about it and discern and talk to people so that when you're ready to take that next step, you can go hard and strong, right? If you don't do the prep work, you cannot be successful when you're trying to implement things. When I was a kid, I wanted to, if I went to the buffet line, I want to jump right to the desserts and just eat desserts, right? Nah, we're all adults now, right? You can't just do the dessert thing, right? You got to go through and you got to go through the process because at the end, you're going to be so much stronger for it. Okay. And finally, part of this kind of goes back to this idea of flexibility. Everything is subject to change. We don't know what the heck is coming at us, right? We don't know what's coming at us. So we've got to maintain that sense of flexibility. So let's go to the next slide. So a few things. Oh yeah, so let's think about it like this. Again, we're going to throw metaphors around like crazy today. Let's think about building on a structure. Could be building on an addition to a house, could be building a building, whatever it is. You don't just like walk in and like bring a hammer and nails and say like, I'm ready to go. Let's do this thing, right? Before you can build anything, you have to do kind of survey the site. You have to build the blueprints. Then you actually start building the building. But you can't stop there either. You have to keep inspecting the building. Is it going right? So what this process does is it kind of walks us through what it is to kind of survey the area. It's that research component. You're going to have to do some research. And then you're going to kind of draw out the blueprints. And those are your objectives. That is what you want to build. So based off of your research, based off of what you're seeing in the community, understanding your mission, you're like, here's how we're going to function. And then it's in that third step, programming, they're actually going to start building things out, right? You figure out how to communicate to your key constituents. You're going to figure out budgets. You're going to actually implement. You're going to start practicing and trying some things. And then in that fourth step, think about like the inspector coming through all the time, right? You always have to be evaluating what you're doing, right? So an easy way to think about this is ROPE, Research Objective Program Objective, or evaluation. I don't have it up in front of me. I'm just trying to remember it. But think about it, this idea of, and this is where we come with this idea of a rubber band. This is a strategic planning process that people have used to do major strategic planning. They may call it differently, but it's these 4 basic steps. And even in our personal lives, for making kind of smallish, medium-sized-ish decisions, if we go through this process, we're likely to make a better decision, right? Research, what is my objective? How do I do it? And then do it and evaluate it. Okay, so I'm going to now jump over. First off, any comments about all that prelim, and we're going to dive into all this. SK is going to lead us through a chunk of this. But if you all have thoughts or questions at the very beginning of this, throw that hand up, put it in the chat, and we'll take a second here to do that. I know it can feel like drinking from a fire hose with us. We're so sorry. We want to get content out to you, and then we'll have some other opportunities to really break it down together in conversation if that's helpful.
For sure. All right. Well, barring any other questions, let me jump in here to this process. So as Patrick has really helpfully laid out for us, the first step that we're inviting you to think about is the research piece. like Patrick said, a lot of us want to jump right into the doing of this process. And I also just want to name that like comes from a really good place of that we've all been sitting through this and trying to serve our communities through this. And we want to get done with it and get on with the show. But the problem there just is that you're coming to what you would like to do and what you'd like to see with just your perspective, and kind of assuming that that is what everybody else sort of understands about the situation that we find ourselves in. And we know that that's just not true. So whether we are believing that that's what we're doing or not, that can kind of be the tendency in these processes, right? So in this sort of research phase, we're going to offer some kind of prompts and sub-steps and processes for this. And some of that I think is really useful to do on an individual level. This goes back to what Patrick was just saying, as like a journaling exercise or an individual kind of reflecting exercise about where we've been and where we are. But when we're thinking about this research phase, what we're picturing is being in the conference room at the diocesan office with flip charts and Post-its and getting lots of participation and voices from everyone in the room to kind of go through the space and do this. And that is still something that you might consider doing in person in your program and with your staff and volunteers, or there are lots of incredible resources and tools to do this in the digital space too. So just want to name that. And if you need some ideas of resources and tools that you can go to, reach out to us. We've got some really great ones from various programs. So the first kind of invitation in this research phase is to do some reading and to really kind of ground yourself in what people are saying about the population that you're serving. Excuse me. What are the needs there and how have those changed? So if you look in your workbook, you'll see this little worksheet here too. And the resource bundle, that behemoth of a document that Patrick mentioned before, that might be a good place to start with, to look at some places to do some research and do some reading. And we just invite you to kind of take some notes about what the experts are saying about what the situation was for your population pre-pandemic, in this moment, whether that means at the sort of height of the pandemic when it all hit, or where we are right now with this sort of light at the end of the tunnel moment. And where do we think, what are people saying we think is going to be the impact in the long term?
And one of the things in the research bundle that you'll see, the objective is don't read out 130 pages, or do if you want to. But the idea is like there's one really solid article on mental health issues in the pandemic. There's a really solid one on food insecurity. There's a really solid one on the homeless population. And so the idea is to get kind of different topics that you may be interested in and read one of those articles. Or go through the resources that we've linked on that front cover page. You can look at your county and our estimations for food insecurity in your county, which may be really helpful to do if you're in a feeding program. Or there's stuff about immigration or any number of those topics. So the idea is not to like go through all of it and be an expert. It's to like pick your area and go into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then to look at what you're reading and say, how does that resonate with what I've seen and what my experience has been on the ground? Where are there connections with what we're seeing, and where might there be some dissonance in what you're reading and what you're seeing and doing? And then when you've sort of grounded yourself in the larger context of what's going on, then you can really localize into your particular place and your particular role and your team. So this first exercise that we've offered it's on page 4 of your little workbook here, is some just individual kind of reflections to think about where you stand individually right now in this moment. What do you think are your strengths as a leader? What do you know that you are bringing to the table in your organization and that you know are going to go well? And what are the things that might be a little bit more of a struggle, or that we might need to delegate to someone else in your community, or to put some extra time and effort into? What values do you have? Why are you doing the work that you're doing? What drives you to do this? That one I think is really helpful for sort of making decisions and weighing your priorities. How has your program successfully been transformative in this moment? Where are you seeing lives being transformed? And what are your concerns about the program too? And all of these, we invite you to kind of think about, as I said before, as pre-pandemic, during, and after, and really looking at how have all of these things changed and how might they continue to change. And along with that is this kind of most important thing, which is how are you feeling? This moment has been really hard, and it's a good time to kind of pause and take stock and see where you are and where your individual sort of feeling and capacity and ability to move forward is. And then you want to get some input from other leaders in your community. So whether this is other staff in your outreach program, or volunteers or board members, parish leadership, you want to invite them to wrestle with those same questions on a more collective level. What is everyone seeing about your program's strengths and struggles? What values do you all share that kind of guide you as a team and keep you working together in a group? And how are you collectively doing? When you put it all in aggregate, where is the energy level and what might we all be able to do together? Oops. So we've looked at the context, we've gotten a little bit more grounded in what we've seen and felt and our reflections about our program. And then we want to really dive into the numbers and the data and what has been happening at your program. So these are the same questions to ask of pre, during, and post-pandemic, and looking at the numbers of people that you're serving, whether that's your food bank reports for food programs, to look at your data, however you're doing that. What are you noticing? What are the large patterns that you're seeing? What's the demographic breakdown? How is that shifting? Are you seeing different populations seeking services from you? Do you expect that to continue? How might those shifts continue to change? And what's surprising to you? Sometimes when we pause and look at all of this in aggregate over the entirety of the pandemic, we can pull out sort of larger themes and patterns, and you might find that those are sometimes surprising to you. So take note of those. And then think about your resources and your budget. How has the way that you're spending money or using your resources changed? How has the way that you are bringing money in, fundraising and getting gifts from your donors, how has that changed? And what is the role of your staff and volunteers? Maybe you had a super robust, wonderful volunteer program pre-pandemic and then had to scale back down to a skeleton crew of volunteers. And now it's time to start thinking about what is the role of volunteers going to look like after this moment, and how can we continue to bring more people in? Then we want to be talking to clients. And this is like the biggest, kind of most important one, I think, for me. If we've got this in the workbook too, but if our objective is to serve a particular community and we don't get them involved in the decision-making or get their input on what's happening, we sort of further this us-them dynamic that we're trying to avoid. So we want to be having conversations with the clients that you're serving, and whether that is more formal, like focus group kind of conversations, or if that's just showing up on the day of service and checking in with people one-on-one. What are people feeling anxious about? What are they worried about down the line? How are their needs shifting? Where is their biggest need? I like to ask if you had a magic wand question, what's the one thing that you would fix? How are new clients finding you? Has that changed? Is it word of mouth? clients speaking to each other? Is it your signage and efforts that you have done to get the word out about your program? How are people finding you, and what can you do with that? And are there consistent roadblocks or patterns that are showing up that are keeping people in your community from flourishing? Every organization, as we know, has assets and deficits too. So that's kind of the next thing that we want to look at as a team. And this is going to be, I think, pulling from some of the reflections that you've done in previous parts of this process. But we want to encourage you to think about the assets and the deficits that you have in your program, and to think of those beyond financial resources. So we've kind of offered some categories here and in the worksheet of different categories that you might think of your assets and deficits in. But these are this is definitely not exhaustive, and be creative as you're thinking about where your assets and deficits are. The hope really is that this research phase will help you and your community to really be grounded in where you are now and how things have shifted, so that we can have everything sort of out in the open, out on the table, up on the wall on the big Post-it paper, so that we can really look at that from all of our stakeholders, have the richest, fullest understanding of what has been going on from everyone's perspectives, and then figuring out how to move forward beyond that.
Great. Is this all making sense? Like, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or like slow down or go faster, or
I know I can only see my face, so
see, we've got thumbs
me.
up. I see hearts and thumbs up. I see lots of that. We're good to go.
Beautiful.
So what we want to do next is, so if we think about this as we start off in the research of like, we're reading an article from the Atlantic talking about vaccination or whatever, right? So big picture, right? And then we kind of bring it in a little bit and like, okay, what's going on in my community, right? Okay, what's going on with my volunteers and my leaders, right? What's happening with it here? And so what we want to do is we're taking all of that information in, and now we're going to try to synthesize it, right? We're going to take all of this stuff that we've had, and this is one of the reasons why it's helpful to do it like on a big piece of butcher paper, or sitting with a journal, or talking in a group, or doing it digitally, so that we can actually begin to see these things out. Because what we're going to do then is we're going to start making some objectives, right? This is where we're going to start drawing the blueprint. Again, if we don't do the research, then we don't know what kind of building we need to build, right? We don't know what we need to do in that building. We don't know how much money is going to take to build that building, right? If we are not talking to our community in that research phase, then we're building something for a problem that may not exist, right? We're just missing the point. And so we're going to spend energy and resources doing something that's not needed, when there is a need that you could be meeting, but aren't meeting, right? This is why that research time is so critical, and why, if you look at our outlines and stuff like that, we spend more time on the research section and the objective section than we do on the other two portions, okay? That research is the most important. So what's going to happen here is we're going to take all of this information we've got, and then we're going to try to put it through a filter. And the filter is our mission, right? One of the pieces in our workbook says, what's your mission? Like, and again, there are large organizations that go through months and year process about coming up with their mission, and every word is chosen just right. And that's really important and great. But if that's not you, that's okay. What are you about in one sentence? At the very core of what you do, what are you about? And that's going to be pretty close to what your mission is, right? What are you trying to do? We're trying to alleviate food insecurity in my neighborhood. We want to make sure those people coming out of the correctional system have a support and an education. Like, that's what we're going to do. So have your mission. And then what's going to happen is you're going to take all of this information you've gathered, right? And you're going to put it through that mission, because now we're going to figure out what our role in all of this is. And the only way we can do that is through our mission. Okay. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting objectives. So objectives are the action items, the kinds of things we're going to do in response to the situation filtered through our mission. SK. Oh, sorry, I just saw you on mute. I think that's up. So what we're gonna do, and I think one of the really important things, let's go to the next slide. Oh no, yes, I'm sorry, I'm looking at two different things here, sorry. One of the things that can be, when we're thinking about our mission and we're thinking about the overwhelming nature of this world that we're in, the pandemic, is trying to figure out the things you can and you can't control, right? The world is overwhelming right now. And there is a sense in many of us of wanting to go save everything and everyone. And we can't. We're not able to do that. And so I think one of the really helpful items here is to think about the serenity prayer, right? Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So there are things that you cannot do, but there are things that you need to have the courage to try to do. And one of the tools in that wisdom in the prayer is your mission, right? Is your mission is to be like, what are we about? Okay, this is what I'm about, then that's the direction I'm gonna go. And that's the part of the world I think I can have an impact on, right? So this serenity prayer, I think, is really helpful in framing how we're gonna get to our objectives. Because the way my mind works is like, I wanna have 1,000 objectives and save everything. Well, that's not really my job, and that's really not what I should be doing. And I'm not gonna really do any of those things very well. It's only when we begin to focus in on that area, that unique space that we have kind of a mission to, that's where you have really dynamic impact. It's not when we're spread out everywhere, okay? So look to those kinds of things. One of the ways you can do this is essentially, I'm gonna skip ahead to a Venn diagram. Yeah, a Venn diagram is a helpful image for this, right? So if we look at, and the way you can do this in the workbook is, we're gonna ask you to kind of create a list of community needs, right? What are the needs in my community that I'm seeing? What am I hearing from our guests and our clients? You're gonna list out your assets, the things that you're good at, right? The things you have the most potential for, the things that that you have in place. We have a facility, we have some resources, we have connections, whatever it is. You're gonna list those things out. And then you're gonna start listing out what are your passions, like what drives your organization? What gets your volunteers to show up early on a Tuesday morning to pack boxes, or a Thursday afternoon to do tutoring? What engages them that way? And then what we're gonna do in the Venn diagram is we're gonna try to bring them together, and we're gonna see where that overlap hits. And that's your sweet spot, right? That's your spot that you're like, we're gonna build from there. And we may have to do some of these other things, but like, we're gonna start in this kind of core middle space, and we're gonna build out from there. Again, this is a great project to do with groups, and there's virtual ways of doing it in the virtual space, or with your teams, whatever it is. But again, all of these areas have to kind of hit. You may be passionate about something, but if it's not a need in the community, like, go do it in the afternoon or whatever. Like, let your outreach program have an impact.
Patrick, can I interrupt you
Yes,
for
please.
just a second? There's some interesting chat going on
Oh,
in
great.
the chat here, and some questions coming up around talking to clients and talking to the community, particularly in the COVID context where we're doing grab and go meals and we're really trying to keep the food line moving so that we're not creating an unsafe environment of folks hanging around. And challenges of various populations that we're working with. Laurel from St. Ignatius is saying that some of the folks that they're serving have mental illness challenges, and so sometimes the conversations are difficult or don't really yield any real information. And I also want to note that Alice has helpfully said that the food bank has a client information form, which is a form that clients can fill out that will tell you what other benefits they're receiving. And that's one way to look at needs. Yeah, sorry.
This is really great. So a couple other thoughts on that. One is, if you can't have direct conversation with your clients, talk to experts that also work with your clients. You're not the only one that works with them, right? And so get a conversation going with other agencies that you may partner with, or are working with the same population, and be like, hey, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you thinking about in this post-pandemic world? So that's the first thing. The second thing is the conversation. So if there's a food line, for instance, and again, you're trying to get people in and out, bring some of your leadership and your volunteers that feel comfortable with this, have them outside in the line, keeping social distance. You can kind of take a walk away from the line for a minute and be like, hey, we're trying to get some information about what's going on in your world. People are usually pretty comfortable talking about what's going on in their world. You're not going to, an invitation is not a mandate, right? If someone has their head down and is not trying to make eye contact with anyone, don't go up to them. Like, let them be. But we all know clients and guests in our programs that are dying to talk to someone. Give them something to talk about. Tell us what the pandemic has been like for you. What are you scared about for the next 3 months? What are you scared about for the next 6 months? How are your kids doing? Right? So these are, I'm going to use the word pastoral, and I don't mean in a priestly way. I mean in a kind of a compassionate, human to human. Tell me what's going on. How are you? And then it's asking some of those future questions. What keeps you up at night? Where do you think we're going to be in 6 months? If they're new to the food line, maybe you're like, do you think you'll be here in 6 months? Well, I don't think so. I think I got a job lined up. I'm like, that's cool. You're trying to kind of pull information in, right? And so I think I just saw something in the chat. We used to have a volunteer whose job was just to engage with people waiting outside.
Yeah.
And again, whether that was a pre-pandemic practice or not, it should probably be a post-pandemic practice, is having a volunteer who's just walking the line, and just whose job is just to engage. And again, we have those volunteers, right? Like, I'm sure most of you can think of that. Oh, that's so-and-so. They would do that.
Right. It's a great way to sort of like empower and give some leadership and ownership to your volunteers too. I've seen that be really, really successful. There's another question coming up, Patrick, about language barriers. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit in the program implementation part. So do you want to keep rolling?
No,
and get
do it
to
right
that?
now.
Okay, great. So Priscilla is saying that they have a large proportion of the folks they're serving are not English speakers. And so they're doing a lot of like using their hands to interpret and try to communicate. And so getting information about what's going on for their community is a little bit of a challenge there.
Yeah, absolutely. We just got a note yesterday from a program leader who was dealing with this exact thing. I believe the issue was with Mandarin, if I remember correctly. We found a volunteer who can translate. Finding volunteers who speak the language of your target community is important. right? It's one thing we all understand, like, no, here, there, but like to have any level of real connection, there has to be some language, right? And so it's about trying to recruit volunteers that can help you with that. I know of one program who in the city got a community liaison officer who spoke a particular language to do translating and kind of walk the line with them for several weeks. There are resources out there. If that's an issue for you, reach out to us and we'll brainstorm some ways of meeting that need. But language, again, if we want to be, and again, I'm gonna use a churchy language here, incarnate in with the community, we need to have people that are speaking the language so that we can hear from the community. Okay, so getting those volunteers are really important, and Episcopal Charities, we may be able to help you with that. What you'll see on the next slide here is this idea of what a good objective is, what it looks like. We have to go beyond just saying we want to get more food into the community. I don't know what that means. I'm guessing as a program officer, I read a lot of stuff, right? And I can read an entire paragraph sometimes in an application and have no idea how to measure that. Like where it's all, it's easier to just do boilerplate. We want to be more active in our community. We want to help more students, right? Those aren't, quote, smart objectives, right? Smart objectives are specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're relevant, and they're time-based, right? So in our kind of silly example here, we went from get more food into the community to, excuse me, providing emergency food to our community, particularly fresh produce, protein, shelf-stable milk. Distribute this to the 200 families that are registered in our program at our monthly distribution for the next 12 months. Now, that's a very specific, right? But just because you have an objective that's specific doesn't mean you're going to hit your objective every time. And that's okay, right? But what it is going to tell you is how you need to calibrate, right? So if you can't afford to meet this objective, well, that's when you say, this is really important to us. Let's call up Episcopal Charities, not because we're going to write you another check, because we can't always do that, but we're going to say, like, how do we help meet this thing? This is what we're doing. So that is a different conversation to have with us or with other programs or your volunteers or your leadership, because it's a goal-oriented thing, right? As opposed to calling someone and saying, hey, we want to do better. Because my next question is going to be, well, how do you want to do better? In what ways do you want to meet the needs in your community? Which needs are you trying to meet? If you can't meet all the needs, which ones are you going to try to do? And maybe in the pandemic, you have heard from people who the cost, I was talking to another program that works with senior citizens, and sanitation issues can't be bought with SNAP benefits. And they're like, Patrick, I have more senior adults coming and trying to get like adult diapers or those kinds of things. How do I get that? Right? That's a specific need with a specific objective. I can help you with that because I'll make a connection with this person or that person. Right? But it's trying to be specific. And then you can calibrate along the way. Ooh, that was too big of a goal. Our objective should be 100 people. Okay, and do that. Or people got excited about this and we raised a ton of money and we got a new freezer. And so we can do 300 now, right? You calibrate, you move back and forth. We're running close on time. So I'm gonna kind of dive through the building out process. And this is really going to be looking at issues of prioritization and synchronizing, right? Once you have these objectives laid out for yourself, you have to put them in order, right? You can't do everything in one foul swoop. you will destroy yourself, your volunteers, your infrastructure, and the community you're trying to serve. So all 4 of those you want to keep good. And if you try to do everything all at one time, all 4 are going to be damaged by it, right? So here's where you have to kind of start figuring out, where can we get some wins, is how I often think about it. When you're trying something new, I'm always like, how do we get that first win? It doesn't have to be a big win, but how do I get that first win so that we can build some momentum on it, right? How do I think about this plan in phases? I think immediately we need to accomplish these 3 things. In 6 months, we want to look at these 4 things, right? So when you're thinking about how to implement these things, think about prioritization and synchronization and synchronizing these things. Communication, you'll see you want to think about who you're communicating with. Is it your clients? Is it your volunteers? Is it your staff? Who is it? Then you want to think about what you're trying to communicate, a new priority, a new process. Is it whatever it is? And then that third thing you want to think about, that third category, is how you want to communicate with them. Through an email? Is it through posters? Is it through one-on-one conversations? Is it through small groups? And then in all of this, we want to make sure there's this translation element. And the translation is not just about language, Spanish or Mandarin or anything like that. You have clients that don't read. How are you making sure you're communicating with those clients that aren't readers? How are you connecting with those clients who can't see, right? How are you finding ways of connecting with those clients that you need to get the information out? And then I want you to look at, there's issues with budgeting, and there's all kinds of budget stuff you can talk about. The thing I want to highlight in this, as we're kind of beginning to wrap up here, is an invitation to the community you're serving with and you're serving in. Your clients, inviting your clients to participate in, we're going to redo the pantry. You're not setting up a thing that says, in order to come to the pantry, you have to work here at all. But if we just are always saying, no, 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 I do this, I help you, and you take food, right? We can set this dynamic up. So if you're doing a project in your community, in your program, invite those who are participating in your program to be a part of it. Again, an invitation is not a requirement. Have a party. If you're doing something, once everybody's back together again and you're you're packing grocery bags, invite your clients to do it with you. Be in community, give them an opportunity to feel a part of something. Don't be afraid of that. Eske, I'll let you finish it off here.
Great. Awesome. And I'd also just want to add too about what you were just talking about, Patrick. We had a helpful comment in the chat a few minutes ago talking about having clients and guests serving as volunteers and how helpful that can be.
Awesome.
In terms of getting information and really communicating between. Just wanted to name that.
Because they have credibility in the community. If I'm in the South Bronx, I was running a program there, and there were some line issues, and they're like, Patrick, go take care of that. I'm like, I'm not going to be the white guy who shows up and is telling people where to go and they can't have food. And they're like, oh, I'll do it. And I'm like, members of the community, they're known, stuff like that, right? Get people with buy-in and credibility there. Sorry.
All good. So this last phase is the evaluate phase. And this is really related to that research that you did at the beginning. You're really coming back to that and coming back to the SMART objectives that you've developed and saying, how did we measure up to that? And what worked well to get us to be able to do that? Or what was a challenge that made that a little bit more difficult? Are there things that were surprising to us or things that it would have been really nice to have known 6 months ago? Things along those lines. And have we been able to meet the needs of the community in the way that we had hoped? And how have those needs shifted? And what might we do in response to that, right? Might we work through this process on a smaller scale to figure out how to shift again to respond to those needs? This is the time to think about that. So it really is sort of the research process in reverse, and a little bit smaller, and just really taking stock of where we've ended up. And that's about it, I think.